The Roman general and warlord, Gnaeus Pompeius, is today known in the English-speaking world as Pompey the Great. He earned his cognomen Magnus, or the Great, for his outstanding generalship as a partisan in defense of Sulla's reactionary regime, and as a homage to his childhood hero, Alexander the Great. But there was another nickname for the young aristocrat that was whispered by his opponents and men who he had wronged. Behind his back, Pompey was called the Young Butcher, or Adolescentius Carnifex, due to the brutality and ruthlessness he showed towards all who fought against the Sullan regime. He had no qualms about executing those who surrendered. Even leading men in the Republic, such as the father of Brutus, would be killed on Pompey's orders. His behavior shocked polite opinion, even among those who backed the Sullan order, and symbolized that the younger generation, which had grown up in the midst of constant legitimacy crisis and civil wars, was not committed to the core values of the Republic. It says something about the decline in Republican sentiment that it was actually Pompey who would serve as the standard-bearer for the Republic in the Senate's war against Julius Caesar. Pompey lost that war, and with it, any hope of reconstituting the Republic as envisioned by the old aristocracy. In his victory, Caesar attempted something new and radical, a regime that was founded on consent of the governed and clemency instead of over the corpses of slain foes. But ultimately, he would perish at the hands of men whom he had forgiven and accepted back into public life. His heir, Octavian, vowed not to make the same mistake. Allying himself with Mark Antony and Lepidus, two of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants, the three men would constitute a pact known as the Second Triumvirate, and would begin their reign by soaking the streets of Rome in blood. Unfortunately, history does not record if Octavian earned a nickname akin to Pompey's Young Butcher moniker, though the scale of the bloodshed that he authorized would go far beyond Pompey's killings. It's likely that Octavian never earned this name, not because of any reservations on his part, but because by the time the Second Triumvirate was done, there was no one left in Rome that could voice any opposition to the pact. Centuries of relatively open political debate in the Republican tradition were coming to a close and would never be revived. The Triumvirs negotiated their alliance on a small island near the colony of Mutina, not far from where forces loyal to Octavian had done battle with those fighting for Antony. Antony was defeated, but in a true hinge point of history, both of Rome's consuls perished in this battle. And sensing the power vacuum, Antony and Octavian joined forces to commit Rome's legions to war with Brutus, Cassius, and the other remaining conspirators behind the assassination of Caesar. As the only men in Italy with armies, the Triumvirate's control of the state was now absolute, and the three men assigned themselves territories that they would govern while also dictating the consuls for the next 5 years. The facade of republicanism was broken forever. The Triumvirs were faced with two pressing issues as they seized control of the state. They were worried about the continued presence of Republican elements in the city that would oppose their power grab, and they desperately needed to raise money for the inevitable war with the forces Brutus and Cassius were gathering in the east. They managed to kill 2 birds, and a lot of senators, with 1 stone, by initiating the process known as proscription, which made it legal to kill targeted individuals and allowed those who brought in their heads to claim a share of the victim's estate, with the rest of the money going into state coffers. The brutal use of roving death squads to hunt down those condemned as enemies of the state had been employed by warlords in the past, such as Marius and more notably Sulla. Still, it was horrid business to draw up names of individuals that would be condemned to death, and our sources indicate that the Triumvirs engaged in much negotiation over who would be prescribed. In the end, each committed to allowing a close friend or family member to be condemned to place a final, irrevocable seal on the pact. In total, roughly 2,500 individuals, including 300 senators, were killed on the orders of Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, ranging from distinguished elder statesmen like Cicero to undistinguished and politically inactive equestrians that were simply killed so that the Triumvirs could confiscate their family fortunes. Cicero is by far the most famous victim of these bloody purges, but we can't forget the thousands of others who died in such horrifying conditions, often for no actual slight against the new regime, but because Octavian and his allies coveted their wealth. Appian describes the terror that gripped Rome in those dark days.
Straightway, throughout city and country, wherever each one happened to be found, there were sudden arrests and murder in various forms, decapitations for the sake of the rewards when the head should be shown, and undignified flights and disguises which strangely contrasted with former splendor. Some descended into wells, others into filthy sewers. Some took refuge in chimneys. Others crouched in the deepest silence under the thickly packed tiles of their roofs. For some were not less fearful of their wives and ill-disposed children than of the murderers, while others feared their freedmen and their slaves. Creditors feared their debtors, and neighbors feared neighbors who coveted their lands. There was a sudden outburst of previously smoldering hates, and a shocking change in the condition of senators, consulars, praetors, tribunes, men who were about to enter upon these offices, or who had already held them, who threw themselves with lamentations at the feet of their own slaves, giving to the servant the character of a savior and master. But the most lamentable thing was that even after this humiliation, they did not obtain pity.
The names of many victims have sadly been lost to history, but in addition to the well-documented fate of Cicero, Appian also relays the tragic story of a young aristocrat named Attilius, who was added to the proscription lists on the day he came of age, meaning he was probably between 15 to 17 years old. The triumvirs waited until he reached legal adulthood so as not to appear guilty of murdering a child, simply to claim his estate. Needless to say, Attilius was not active in politics, and was as surprised as anyone to learn he was condemned. His friends abandoned him on the spot, and even his mother refused to shelter him. Such was the fear the populace had of the triumvirs' death squads. Attilius fled the city and hid in the surrounding mountains, but was soon forced by hunger to leave his cave. Emaciated and dressed in rags now, he was assumed to be a person of no importance, and was forced into slavery by a local bandit who had a habit of enslaving any wayward travelers. Eventually, Attilius escaped, and rather than go back to a life of slavery, he confessed his true identity to a group of centurions, who instead of helping the poor boy, murdered him on the spot. It is a horrifying tragedy, and we can only wonder how many of the other victims of the Triumvirate could tell similar tales of woe. Later in his career, Octavian would celebrate himself as the man who brought peace back to Rome, but the false peace he provided was built on the corpses of countless people like Attilius. The purges of the Second Triumvirate were successful in squashing all political resistance to the new regime, but they ultimately fell far short of raising the necessary funds to finance an invasion of the eastern territory held by Brutus and Cassius. With so much property hitting the market at the same time, prices fell sharply for land that would have once fetched exorbitant sums. In addition, some of the potential buyers may have felt a sense of revulsion at buying property that once belonged to friends or family before the spate of confiscations. However, it's also likely that few were willing to draw attention to just how much cash they had on hand, and out themselves as tempting targets for the triumvirs' gangs of headhunters. So Octavian and his allies still needed to find much of the money needed to pay the 43 legions at their command, and so turned to unprecedented methods to raise further funds. They taxed the people of Rome, something which had not been done for centuries and was incredibly unpopular. Even more unpopular, not to mention sacrilegious, was the decision to confiscate the personal savings that Romans had deposited in the Temple of Vesta, breaking every taboo then known to both gods and men. But with so many soldiers now loyal to the triumvirs, there was no way to turn this popular anger into political change. Octavian's reprehensible behavior during the proscriptions seems to have been widely forgotten, with most now subscribing to the view that his actions were always undertaken with the best of intentions for the Roman people. This is the image that he worked tirelessly to create, after he seized sole control of the Roman state in 31 BC. During the next 4 decades of his one-man rule, Octavian and his close advisor, Messianus, would employ talented writers such as Virgil and Horace for an ambitious propaganda campaign presenting Octavian and his regime as universally beloved and the culmination of all Roman history. It is this propaganda image that has largely come down to us through the ages, and one that unfortunately has been uncritically relied on by historians until very recently. We owe it to Octavian's victims to interrogate the narratives of his regime and tell history that has been suppressed. One key element of Octavian's propaganda was the decision to award himself a new name. He had long been known as Gaius Julius Caesar, in imitation of his adoptive father, but he would gain a new name from a cowed senate when they awarded him the title Augustus, meaning revered one. This is the name by which he is widely known today. It is a testament to the success of his propaganda that he has gone down in history as a conciliatory figure and a wise statesman, instead of the blood-soaked warlord he was in actuality. If he was ever called something akin to the young butcher, then that has been lost to time. While his victory may seem complete, we must remember that we are not at the end of history, and figures from antiquity are always being reevaluated as they fall in and out of favor with each passing generation. Instead of remembering Octavian as he is presented in the words of Virgil, we can instead remember him through the words of another poet, one whose name has been lost to history, but whose words have been preserved thanks to Suetonius. The satirical poet scrawled graffiti on one of Augustus's statues, saying, "I did not take my father's line. His trade was silver coin, but mine Corinthian bronzes." This is a mocking reference to the shameful money-lending that was said to have built the fortune of Octavian's father, but also to the young autocrat's passion for collecting the fine bronze sculptures of the proscribed. It's a thing of striking beauty to me that these lines can do so much to shatter the image of Octavian as a cool and disinterested statesman acting in the benefit of all Rome, even when engaged in unsavory practices. Instead, he is here exposed as someone who personally profited from the proscriptions, and this should color our perception of his entire career. Thanks to a nameless poet, we can stand on firmer ground when we call Octavian's regime into question. One goal of our channel is to inspire you to speak out like this. It may seem that your words are falling on deaf ears now, but who knows? Someone might be hearing your voice 2,000 years later.
Hi, this is Titus from Triumvirate. If you enjoyed the video you just saw by Gaius, and if you're interested in thoughtful content that explores the complex culture of the ancient Romans, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.